Hello, this is Gary.
Hey Gary, how you doing? Lance Lopez here.
Hey,
So
man,
sorry,
what's going
so
on?
sorry for the late call. I'm here in my studio. We ran over time, so I got here as fast as I could. My apologies.
No, you're good. I didn't even realize it was the fourth that I said.
I know we're here working. Like we've got shows this weekend, so we're sitting here with our guitars in our hands, like rehearsing for the weekend.
oh,
So we're while everybody's barbecuing, we're working.
hey, see, that's what I'm talking about. It
We're
it
in here rehearsing.
that's cool. That it never ends. You got to keep going, man.
It does, man. It really does. It really does.
You know all about growing up in the South, so that's a cool
Yeah.
thing.
Oh
See,
yeah.
a lot of people don't understand what it's like, uh,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
but that's
Oh,
a,
I know
but
for sure.
right. So
Oh, absolutely. I date a girl. I'm dating a girl right now. She's from Chicago, and she has no clue. Like she's never been to Texas.
oh wow,
She's never she's been in New Orleans. Now she's been down there quite a bit. Because New Yorkers have got quite a connection with New Orleans.
yeah,
That's kind of a whole different deal.
right.
But you know what I'm saying. But to go, yeah, she's gonna go out on the road with us here in a few months. So she's gonna get the full meal deal.
Well, well, I'm sure you'll help her guide her
Yeah,
along
oh
through
yeah.
everything.
She's figuring it out living in Nashville now. Like she's getting it, but it's quite a culture shock. And I was up there quite a bit, as a kid playing blues with all the guys I did. So I had the advantage of that. But
Yeah,
she took me, she grew up in the suburbs up there, and she took me all around it. And that was a whole other side of Chicago that I'd never seen.
right,
I'd always been downtown in the blues clubs and blah blah blah.
right,
So that was really cool, to see like, that kind of side of it is like a whole other world. It's really cool.
right. Uh,
Hmm.
so you grew up in Louisiana, right, and then moved to
Well,
Texas,
yeah,
right?
I was born in Shreveport, and I really grew up in I lived there till I was 12. So my early childhood was all there, and then my teenage years I moved to Texas. So when I was 12, I actually moved to Texas, and I was there early on for a couple of years. My mother was there, so I was there, and my father was in New Orleans. So when we left Shreveport, my mom went to Dallas. My dad went to New Orleans, and so I was with my mom for a couple of years in Dallas, and then went with my dad for a couple of years in New Orleans, and then we all wound back up in Dallas. And then I just kind of stayed there. I moved to Florida briefly for a bit, but that so all kind of around the Gulf Coast was kind of, and then up to in Texas was kind of my home.
Yeah. So your home, yeah, is my home. That I can,
Right.
this Gulf Coast area. Most of the time, you're talking to people and they're like, yeah, well, I'm from California, I'm from New York, and but to have somebody you're talking to that knows everything about the South.
Hmm.
But talking about the music though, when you're growing up, you're hearing all kinds of different songs and sounds
Hmm.
and different kinds of
Hmm.
bands. What were your influences when you were growing up?
Oh man, I mean, I was really, early on, it was all the old school rock and roll, the '50s rock and roll, what I call real rock and roll.
Yeah,
My dad, turned me on to a lot of that great music. He was in the army with Elvis, and they were buddies, so
awesome.
there was a lot of exposure to that music in that world, and so therefore he really, supported me playing guitar, and that's what I wanted to do, and so. He gave me my first guitar, and he gave me a Chuck Berry record. And he said, "If you learn all these songs on the record, I'll get you an electric." So
Oh wow.
that was the whole, drive to learn, teach myself. And there were no, it was a chord book, and get after it.
Yeah,
It's kind of
right.
like get to work. It's like
Yeah, right.
there were really no, like, a lot of kids were taking lessons. I was kind of in there, figuring it out. And so there was a lot of exposure to those records, like Bo Diddley and
Yeah,
then Chuck Berry and Little Richard and all that kind of stuff. And then, being a kid in the '80s, we were seeing, we were going to all the rock concerts that were happening at
sure,
that time.
sure.
We had a Hearst Coliseum there in Shreveport. And so all the kids in the neighborhood, that's all what we did. We didn't have anything else to do. You either went to the mall or you went to the concert,
Yeah,
and so all the kids usually went to the concert. So we all went and we saw all the great bands like Van Halen and AC/DC and Kiss and Rush and all those exposure, Judas Priest, Dio, all the exposure to those bands in the '80s. And so I would watch all those guitar players and all the kids, like all the kids in the neighborhood, were kind of the era of Van Halen and shredding and all that. And I
Yeah.
was kind of more drawn to the players of the generation before, like Jimmy Page and Leslie West and Alvin Lee and Eric Clapton and all the Jeff Beck and all those guys. And
Sure.
so little did I know it, I was really kind of more influenced by the blues based players. And then right when I would go see Angus Young, I saw him probably live more than any other guitar player when I was a kid. And I really was drawn to that style because it was blues based.
Yeah.
I didn't know that really yet until we moved to Texas. And then, and so the kids I grew up playing with, it was really funny because they were like, man, you play so bluesy,
Yeah.
like it was not cool,
Yeah, right.
And I went home and told my dad, I was like, man, the kids are saying I'm playing too bluesy, Dad. And he was like, and he turned me on to BB King. And he's like, he sat down and put on a BB King record. And I was completely floored. Like, it was like, oh my God, that was like the sound I'd been searching for. I mean, It was almost as important as hearing Jimi Hendrix. And when I heard Jimi Hendrix for the first time also, that just totally transformed my world. Like there was that and then everything else, And so that was the other side of it. It was like I was listening to those records. And when I first heard Jimi Hendrix, I thought it was brand new music. I thought it had just come out in the 80s.
Yeah.
I didn't know it was from the 60s. I thought it was I thought it was a brand new album.
Wow.
That's how advanced it was for me as a kid to hear Hendrix for the first time. I thought it was like this brand new thing. And I remember all the kids sitting around laughing at me. They were like, no, this album's 20 years old. I was like, what? I couldn't believe it. And so that was the bar that was set. And I would go watch all of the guitar players. And so we and then I got turned on to BB King. So when we moved to Texas, first thing I saw in the newspaper was a giant picture of BB King, and I asked my mother, I said, can you take me to go see BB King? And she said, absolutely. And so we went, and when we got to the concert, everybody there was wearing these T-shirts that had SRV on them. And we were all going, and I was like, and it was so annoying. Like literally everyone at the concert had one on. And I was like, I didn't even know what it meant. I was like, what is SRV? And why does everybody have these T-shirts on,
Right.
And BB King came out. A lot of people, Dr. John, all these great artists played. And then they came out and said, the DJ came out and said, this guy, Stevie Ray Vaughan's going to come out and headline because this is his hometown. And I was like, no clue what was happening. And then out came this Stevie Ray Vaughan guy that totally just floored my world. Like, I didn't even know he existed.
Wow.
And I had been, listening to Hendrix and like looking for, guitar players that sounded like that or that made, and then and I'd never seen anybody play Hendrix live or even try to attempt play Hendrix live. And here he was playing Voodoo Child. And it was like, wow. So, then that's what made it cool to play the blues. I said, that's it. All the kids had been, oh man, you play too bluesy. And then I experienced that and went, oh man, it's really cool. Now that's where I'm headed. So that was the day kind of really just transformed my world. Like June of 1990.
Wow.
I transformed into, full throttle, just nothing but the blues. I started all over in the Delta. I just consumed everything that was 1920s and 30s Delta musicians. I went to the library.
Wow.
There was no internet back then.
Right.
If you wanted to find something, you had to go dig for it. Go look it up.
Explain that to the kids today. Don't understand what that means. You have to go to encyclopedias. What is that?
Yeah. Books. There was actual books that you had to go dig through, and that was the way we did it. And luckily, my stepfather at that time was he had graduated. He had got a master's, I think, from the University of Southern Mississippi. Oh. So we took a road trip to the University of Southern Mississippi I think in the summer of '91, the following summer. And I went into their basement, and they had vinyl in their basement, and they had
cool.
You could get 5 records for like 10 cents or something. It was ridiculous. And so they had in the basement of the University of Southern Mississippi was just tons of Delta and country blues music. And so I just came home with armfuls of vinyl.
Wow.
I went in there with like $30 and just walked out with
you bought them
stacks of all kinds of stuff and went home with it and just Charlie Patton,
Oh wow.
all that. And so I just kind of I really consumed all that music. And, so it really, and that really kind of helped me later on in life bond with a lot of my heroes, because I had done a lot of that work and had really studied a lot of that music and studied a lot of that Delta blues. It really helped me create bonds with later on with guys that I really, looked up to, that, we all looked up to, and I had something to really talk about with them and
Yeah.
discuss. So it was really cool. It was really cool. So, and then just work my way through, all the electric blues guys, and then, and then everything else that was happening at the time. And and then moved to New Orleans with my father. So he had seen how advanced I had gotten playing guitar. So he started taking me out to playing clubs. And that's what we did. We went out, and I started getting hired by bands, and we would play round the clock. In New Orleans as a kid, I would go play a happy hour gig from from 5 to 8 or whatever, and then we would go play the regular gig that would be from 9 to midnight, and then you go play the after hour gig that was like 2 to 5 a.m.
Wow.
And then I would go home, sleep for 2 hours, and then go to school.
Of course.
So I'd play 3 gigs a night,
Gee.
probably four nights a week, and then I was going to school during the day. And it was a lot. It was
what kind of grades? What kind of grades were you making back
Oh,
then?
I don't even remember. I don't remember. I'm sure they weren't very. They were.
You made the grade in guitar, but you didn't make
I
it.
made the grade in guitar.
That's all that
Yeah.
matters.
No, I was getting by. I was getting
You
by.
survived.
Getting by.
Hey, you could read and write, and that's all you needed.
That's right.
Um,
That's right.
well, how did you meet up with Johnny Taylor?
We moved down to Florida, and I'd just been in different bands, playing in different bands, and playing blues clubs. And when we moved back to Texas, I was friends with his band, some of Lucky Peterson's band, who I later on played with. But I was friends with all of his band members, and they called me and they said, "Hey, we're going to play at this club, this very legendary place called Booker's Arandis," and it was in South Dallas, which was, the African American neighborhood in Dallas, and this club was very legendary. Like a BB King played a concert in town, he went there after and hung out.
Yeah.
It was like that kind of place. Miles Davis hung out there when he was in
Wow.
Dallas. It was like that kind of place. Like all these big heavy people would hang out there. So anyhow, they called me and they were like, "Man, come on down, sit in with us," and I was like, "Sure." So I went over there and jumped in the van with them and went to a gig, went down there and sat in with Lucky. Lucky actually had pulled me up to sit in with him. And I got up and played, and we just, I played a bunch of lead, played a bunch of guitar. And as soon as I stepped off the stage, a guy grabbed me and he was like, "Hey man, can you be in Atlanta in 2 days?" And I was like, "I don't know, man. I got to ask my dad."
Let me check.
Like,
yeah, right.
So that's how it happened. And they as soon as I stepped off the stage, producer, a guy named Butch Bonner, grabbed me and he had been playing the gig. They were looking for a guitar player, and he had just started a record company, and he was like swamped in producing artists, and it could no longer really go on the road. And he was trying to find a guy to replace him on the gig. So that's how I ended up with the gig. I got the gig and went out with Johnny, and as a result of that, played with many great artists like Bobby Blue Bland, Johnny Guitar Watson,
Oh, wow.
Milton, all these great artists that I got to play with because of working with Johnny. So it was just a great experience. There were fines imposed with blown changes. Like if you missed a chord change, it was $50.
Oh wow.
And it was like, serious business, man. So,
Gee.
we wore the outfits, the uniform, the whole thing, the dance steps, the whole bit, the Chitlin
Cool.
circuit, the whole thing,
Wow.
So, and I look at it now, and it was like I was 17. I was just a kid, man. I was just literally a child.
You were
And,
just along for the ride and having fun.
yeah.
But you were trying. Well, how did you meet up with Buddy Miles? Was that during that time?
I went on. I played with Lucky. Like I said, Lucky and I had been friends, and his guitar player left the band. I had been playing. I'd gotten really busy playing around Texas at that time in the '90s, and was playing a lot down in Austin, and all over, with the little trio, just playing blues. And, so I was playing a lot around Austin and Dallas and Houston, and really a lot in Austin, because it was a great time. The '90s were a great time down there. And, and so I was kind of doing that, and I got a call from Lucky Peterson that his guitar player had left. So I joined his band and started touring the world literally extensively with him, playing all the jazz festivals, all the blues festivals. And while I was overseas with Lucky, I was playing the Belgium Rhythm and Blues Festival with him in Pier, Belgium. I met Buddy Miles. Buddy was there. I saw his name on the poster when we arrived to the festival site, and I thought, oh my God, the Band of Gypsies was one of my most influential records.
Wow.
And it's funny because I told my childhood friend, who was my bass player, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, due to an illness. It was really, really tragic, but we grew up together. He was my sidekick buddy. And I told him we would listen to Band of Gypsies, and I would go, dude, he was a bass player. And I was like, dude, one day me and you were going to play with Buddy Miles. And so it was funny. 9 years later, we were standing on a sold out show on stage. And I looked at him and I went, I told you.
Yeah. Hey, can you tell me that something like $1 million is going to fall from the sky and land in my yard? You got to tell me stuff like that.
Exactly.
No,
And it was just crazy. It was crazy like that. And so that's how it happened. Buddy came and he sat on the wings of the stage, and he could, he immediately was like, I could tell by the way you play that you've been on the Chitlin circuit. He knew immediately, like playing with Johnny Taylor, all those guys. Yeah. He knew that because, Jimi Hendrix and him had come from that same world. And so they could tell by, and I was mainly back there being an ensemblist. I was a rhythm guitar player backing a big horn band. There were 4 horns. It was a big horn band, period. And so he could tell by the way I was playing in that horn band that I had done my time out there on that circuit. So, he was super supportive and very, very, very into the deal, and so I said, man, let's work together. Let's try to figure something out and get things happening. And, and then all of a sudden he wound up in Texas. And so that's what was crazy, is that he wound up, in Texas, and we were like, wow. So we immediately began working on multiple projects, and he actually produced my first album, helped me produce my first record. So I wrote so much music with Buddy. And he had a house in Fort Worth, Texas, called the Byers House, Byers, because it was on Byers Avenue, and it was near it was near TCU over in that area in Fort Worth, near Texas, the university, and big beautiful home from the '60s, and it was so crazy because it was furnished. All the furniture was vintage '60s furniture. It had not been updated. It had been built sometime in the mid '60s. So it was this really crazy place. It was like being right in the '60s.
Right.
And we had full backline set up all over the house: Marshall stacks, Fender twins, bass rigs, and a big giant drum kit in the middle of the house. And so all we did all day long was write and come up with riffs and jam all day. And I have so much music that we wrote, that Buddy Miles and I wrote during those times of jamming together, that I've used it pretty much on every record I've ever made since then, and still have riffs that we haven't used yet. I mean, I still have, and that was 25 years ago, so I have music that we've recorded and ideas that we wrote that I've used in everything I've done. So, Buddy and I worked together extensively. We worked a lot at the house together, and, so yeah, he was a big part of my life early on.
And so you got to tour in 2000 with Jeff Beck and Steve Vai. How did that happen? And can you tell me about that?
Well, when my first album, we independently released it, due to the fact that I had worked with Lucky Peterson extensively in Europe. He really, the later tours I did with him, he really pushed me to the front. And I went back out. I rejoined his band as an MD again. I'd left and played with Buddy for a while, then came back and did more tours with Lucky. And when I left, Rico McFarlane had joined as guitar player, and then Rico left, and then I came back. And my first record was out at that time. We had just independently released it. So I took armfuls of them with me over to Europe, and all the promoters that we were that I was working with Lucky on those big shows, I was passing out CDs, and press kits and, et cetera, while I was on tour with him, so I was doing that as well. And he actually encouraged me to do it. He wanted me to take those records over and do that. And so luckily I'd passed them out to enough promoters that they had gotten the CDs, and he was featuring me on a big stage that, I got calls to come back, and I was brought over on a tour by, a guy that worked for a Dutch magazine, Aardschok, which is kind of a rock and metal magazine. They brought me over on a tour, and then just again, more exposure, more people would see us, and boom, and then on to the next company, and then through that next company, they had contacts to get us on those shows.
Awesome.
And so it was very, it was great experiences being around, all my heroes and learning, and very humbling.
Yeah.
I'm
sure.
To say the least.
Jeez.
Especially as a cocky, 23 or 4, I was just a kid, a child.
Yeah.
And so it was a very humbling experience to be around, to stand on stage with Beck and to really, and Vi and see those guys, Steve Lukather and those different guitar players, and really and want to learn from them, basically, and ask questions and learn a lot. So I was very, very fortunate to be around such great artists at a young age.
Well, did you have a chance to have some conversations with Jeff Beck, or did he give you any kind of advice or anything?
I mean, absolutely. We had a lot of great conversations, and he knew how important his early days were to me. He knew how important and how influential his early music was on me as a guitar, and he could hear it.
Yeah.
And and so I think that was what was really cool. And so we talked about that a lot, and he had a lot of really cool, funny stories about those days, and just how, and just really it just kind of laughed it off, because I was just so in awe of it. And he just laughed it off at just how ridiculous it was. So it was, it was so funny, the dichotomy of that, how I was just, the story of them, forming Led Zeppelin, and his friendship with Jimmy Page, and just funny stories around that. All that was just, they were amusing to me, and just, he kind of laughed them all off, and they were just so funny to me. And so a lot of great hangs with Jeff, but we definitely, I got a lot of great stories from the early days from him. So we had some really great hangs.
That's great. Yeah, and you got to play with BB King, and I'm sure you had some convos with him.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, many, many, many great ones. I mean, and he was just the most encouraging, supporting person there absolutely was. I mean, he knew that the new generation had to continue the legacy of the blues. So, he knew that, and he was very aware of that. And he knew that it needed to be, he needed to have, that outlet for us, that to continue on the legacy. I mean, that's the bottom line is. And so he was very aware of that. Therefore, he was so supportive and so loving to all the young artists and young blues guitar players, because that was, what was going to carry on his work. I think, BB was very aware of how influential he was, and how, that his imprint was on all guitar players. And so I think it was special, especially when, I would tell him that, and what his music did to me when I first heard it, and how influential it was, and how I studied it, and et cetera, and he also knew my father, from Shreveport. I think my dad had done some security work for him, back in the 70s. and 80s, and so he knew my father as well. So it was a really interesting situation all the way around. So, totally encouraging, the most supportive. I mean, BB was the best, period. That's why they call him the king, I guess.
That's it. You said it. And soon after that, y'all were awarded the Blues Band of the Year in 2001. How cool was that for you?
I mean, as a young artist, it was a big deal. I mean, we were working really hard. And that was a weird era, too, because that was all in the middle of 9/11,
Yeah.
and it was just, everything was so weird, man. It was just, so, I mean, you remember how weird it was back
Yes.
then. Everything was just so, like, oh, man, it was just, just such a strange situation.
Sure.
So
Sure.
we just kept rolling, touring around that time. And that's when I did, Steve Vai and I went out right after that. And so it was just a very tense and interesting time to travel and tour and et cetera. So I was doing a lot of those tours during that time. So yeah, it was around that era that we won that. It was a big deal. I mean, it was a big deal to be supported at home and to really, receive those accolades when I got home from Europe. And it was really cool. I mean, I was really, really honored that I was receiving those type of accolades back home. It was really great.
Yeah. Um, and you worked with Eric Gales on your second album, Wall of Soul. So how do you, when you make an album, and you're used to that album and you're going to record your second, how do you approach that? What's on your mind when you say I'm going to make another one? What are you going to do differently? What are you going to do with the next? How do you approach each album with fresh ideas, and what do you do about it?
Um, well, I think that it's, for in particular that particular record, Wall of Soul, came about from basically. That's a very interesting story, and why Eric Gales was connected to that album is very interesting. It also involves Buddy Miles and Billy Cotton. Actually involves the Band of Gypsies. Um, it's a very interesting story. Eric and Buddy Miles were being managed by the same guy that was managing the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and a couple of other big major artists. And so he was working with the Hendrix Foundation at that time to make a Band of Gypsies return record with Billy Cox and Buddy Miles. And they were going to have a slew of great guest guitar players, like the guys we just mentioned, like Steve Vai and Jeff Beck and Slash and et cetera. And so, but they didn't want to have an album that just featured Foxy Lady and Purple Haze and Hey Joe and, Wind Cry, all that same
Yeah.
tribute record after tribute record after tribute record, right? So they
Right.
wanted new, fresh song. So they commissioned Eric and I to provide that. And so I was making trips up to Memphis with Eric to write, and that's where Wall of Soul began. We started working on that album around that time, like right when that's what he put out a record called "That's What I Am" on MCA, and my first record had been out, and we got commissioned to do that. They contacted us and said, we need new material. We want you guys to write the songs, and then we're going to figure out who's going to play on what. So that's how we started writing for the second record, and we didn't know it yet, and then all of a sudden it didn't happen. We had worked on it for almost a year. I had a lot of trips up to Memphis, and Eric and I sat and just kind of, Eric had ideas at home, and I would go back to Dallas and I would write a bunch of ideas, and Eric would write a bunch of ideas. And then I would go back up to Memphis, and then Eric, we'd bring all our ideas together and we'd put them together. And so the album didn't end up happening. I think Billy Cox ended up doing something. I think they did something, but it wasn't what they had planned on doing. So we had amassed all this material that we wrote for this Band of Gypsies thing for these guitar players. So we said, well, screw it. We're going to do it. We're going to record this music. I said, and then I got contacted. So how that happened was we had all this material we had worked on for a year, probably and a half. And it wasn't happening now. And then a label called me from upstate New York. A guy named Joe Romanola has a small guitar label, kind of similar to Shrapnel. Well, and but it was more kind of a blues rock based guitar player label, and called me and said, "Hey, I want to do a record." And I said, "Hi, that's funny." And he goes, "I'd like for you to have a special guest to have Eric Gales on it, and then also to, you know, and help me produce the record." And I was like, "That's funny because we got tons of material we've been working on for quite some time."
It just so happens. Yeah, yeah.
So we went in and started doing it. And then while we were there, I wrote a song, and I said, "Man, this song would be great for Doug from King's X." So we called Doug, who just happened to be home, and
Cool.
he was still living in Houston at that time. And so we brought Doug Pinnick from King's X up, and we did a track with him playing bass, and Eric and I on guitar and the drummer, you know, so that was super cool. You know, so that's how that came about. So to answer that for that question, the second record, a lot of people don't realize how Wall of Soul came about. And it was a very, you know, influential record. I mean, Tyler Bryant and Jared James Nichols and a lot of the young guitar players around at that generation kind of behind me were heavily influenced by it and really came to me with it and said, "Hey man, that record was a big deal to me." So that was a really cool thing to hear about it and to really, you know, to put in the work. But man, you know, that's why it kind of takes me time in between records, because I don't sit here and say, "Man, we need to crank this record out, like crank out 3 a year."
Right.
I like to take my time and make sure that they're good and all the songs are great.
Sure.
You know, that's kind of my deal. So, you know, that's why it kind of sometimes takes time in between my records. I like for them to really take my time with stuff.
Yeah.
Make sure that it's good. So it all comes from riffs, ideas. You know, I'll start with a guitar riff, or I'll start with a guitar. I'm always jotting down phrases. My girlfriend will say something. "Ooh, that's a good title," or "That's a good line." You know, somebody will say something. "Ooh, I gotta," you know, I'm always putting stuff in my phone.
Right.
You know, I'm always coming up with riffs, and we're always recording stuff. And then, you know, once we've amassed enough stuff, we try to put, you know, songs together. And then, you know, I've been working a lot with Joey Sykes, good friend of mine from New York, who's been in LA for years. He's now here in Nashville. And, you know, he's kind of my writer and co-writer. So he's really good at, you know, with a very good pop sensibility. And which helps, you know, because I'm a blues artist. So I come from a much darker place and a much heavier place, especially coming from the heavier rock side of the blues rock thing. Yeah. So it's really good to have that objectivity of a co-writer that can bring in more of a pop sensibility side, or more of a, you know, of a happy medium. How do we kind of lighten up the mood, or have some good chord changes and something that's really great. So I love working with co-writers and people that I can really collaborate with to bring some really good stuff to the table. So that's just kind of how our creative process works, man. I don't force anything. I let it kind of come to the table on its own.
Awesome. You in 2008 through 2011, you supported acts like ZZ Top, Whitesnake, Def Leppard, and Rod Stewart. What's some of your favorite memories from that time? I know you had a lot of fun in those years. Talking about some of the bands that you grew up listening to. I know those are a lot of them, I'm sure.
Oh man, it was such a big deal. I mean, it was, you know, we got, you know, it paid off because, like I told you early on, when I'd gone over with Lucky Peterson when my first record came out, I had passed out my albums to just about every promoter that we worked with Lucky, you know, and Lucky at that time was playing huge concerts, huge shows over there. I mean, they were massive.
Right.
And so I was dealing with a lot of those promoters. Well, as luck would have it, one of those promoters I had given one of those press kids to contacted me years later, and you know, had me playing on a couple. They'd flown me over to play a couple of one-off festivals here and there, and then I then reached back out to me. I'd lived in New York for a while, and he'd reached out to me and wanted to do something. And then when I moved back from Texas from New York, he contacted me and said, we need to do a tour. I'd put out the Higher Ground record, and El Paso Sugar had started to really get a song. El Paso Sugar started to really gain some traction over there, and he reached out and said, "Man, we need to bring you over and have you do some tours. I've got some runs with these bands." And I said, "Absolutely," named off who they were.
Wow.
"Absolutely, we'll go do them." And we kicked off the Higher Ground tour with El Paso Sugar. With El Paso Sugar doing very well, we kicked it off with Def Leppard and Whitesnake in Tirana, Albania, for 80,000 people
Wow.
at their stadium.
That's great.
And it was really one of the first stadium concerts that I ever played in my life. And so it was super cool. It was really great. It was a really great experience. It was a great learning process. Being on the road like that, and really learning on that level. And it was really super gratifying too. And the throw and go big rock concert stuff was very interesting. It was a very great learning experience because you have 24 hours in a day, and then if you're playing a 45-minute set in a stadium before a bunch of huge people, it goes by so fast.
Yeah.
And so that was the other side of it. And I learned to play guitar differently for big rooms and big places. Some of the faster guitar playing kind of gets lost in a big stadium. So
right.
I learned to play big, giant notes and big chords, and that's what was resonating as opposed to a lot of fast shredding.
Right.
So it was a great opportunity to really learn that whole situation. So yeah, those were great times, great tours. From Higher Ground, I put out that, and then we put out, we signed with the SPV label. That was Vanford Schutz, who had worked with Motorhead and Judas Priest and Dio. And so when we signed with him with Salvation from Sundown and Handmade Music, it was nonstop touring extensively over there and playing with a lot of those great bands. So, between those three records and that era, it was heavy, massive touring nonstop.
Well, how did you end up in 2012? You formed the Supersonic Blues Machine. How did you end up playing with those guys?
Well, that's a very interesting story. I had come back after doing those records and Jim Gaines. Matter of fact, let me back up and say that when I was doing those records, the Salvation from Sundown and Handmade Music albums in 2009 and 2011, I had Jim Gaines came in and produced those records. I'd emailed Jim, and I had kind of hit the wall after Higher Ground when I did El Paso Sugar in that record. I played all the instruments on that album.
Cool.
So I played drums, bass, keys, guitars, everything, produced it myself. And I was like, after that, I said, I've got to work with producers. Like I had done everything. I'd played all the instruments. I produced it myself. And I was like, from now on, I'm going to work with a producer.
Right.
I wore myself out, and I'd gotten into my 30s, and I was like, man, I'm going to start working with a producer. So I did. I emailed Jim Gaines, and he said, absolutely, I'd love to. So we worked on a record, and I really was trying to make records that were more like Steve Miller, because he'd done Fly Like an Eagle and Book of Dreams and all these great Steve Miller records.
Right.
And I kind of was trying to get more into the song aspect and more like what Miller kind of did always with these great songs. And Jim had also done Stevie Ray Vaughan's last record, and he did Carlos Santana's Supernatural and a bunch of other great records for Santana. And so we got in the studio and just started turning it more into like a straight up traditional blues record, And I was cool with that, and the second one was a little bit more rock and roll, but, so it was interesting how I had my vision and then he came in and said, we're going to do this, and kind of had his vision and kind of just, directed it the way naturally how it went. So it was a great experience. I learned so much working with Jim Gaines. I learned how to produce in a way that really was really super cool from him. And so it was really awesome. And then did 2 records with Jim Gaines, and then and so after those albums, I had was talking to some friends, and I was over in Europe, and they were trying to connect me with this producer Fabrizio Grossi, and I'd heard his name here and there, and I knew that he knew Billy Gibbons, and people in Europe had been telling me because they knew my connections with Billy Gibbons and the cop, and that he knew Billy Gibbons. And so I said, well, that's cool. So he eventually reached out to me. We were connected through a journalist who sadly is no longer with us. Is a guy named Tony Connolly, a great journalist, connected Fabrizio and I. And we began this, working together, sending ideas back and forth. He wanted to produce me, and so I sent him a couple songs I was working on. He tracked them, sent them back, and so we actually started working on Tell the Truth album first. We started working on my material, and then in the midst of that, it came about Supersonic. I was going back and forth from Dallas to LA, and then I basically was living in LA part time, and working with them. And so I wasn't committed to fully moving to Los Angeles. They were trying to get me to, and I was just, due to the prices and where I was living, I had a great house in Dallas. I was like, this is just not going to work out the way that I really would hope that I was in a lifestyle I was living in Texas versus moving to LA. And so I basically was living with a very close family friend there, and kind of living part-time splitting my time between Dallas and LA, working with Supersonic. And so that's how it began. It just began with ideas and song, like we just talked about, the creative process. We were going out, and I was playing gigs, around Southern California and all around. And then in the midst of, I would go over and after my gigs, and then we would record work and just write songs. We started with songs, and then in the midst of that came about this collective of Supersonic Blues Machine. More artists started to get involved. He started to reach out to other guitar players, and Gibbons wanted to be involved, and he had ideas and stuff for it. So it was a really cool experience, man. I got to play with a lot of great people. I brought in my bro Doug Rappaport from Edgar Winter's band as my utility guitar player to have my back. Who's just one of the most amazing guitar players there is. Like I said, I knew him from Edgar Winter. It was a great experience. Billy and I got to go around the world, play together all over the world. I did those 2 records with them, and it was really great. Steve Lukather and I playing together, Gibbons, Robin Ford, being able to play with all those guys, getting my good friends Eric Gales and Chris Duarte involved. There was a lot. There was a lot of really cool stuff that was around Supersonic Blues Machine. We had plans to bring in Jeff Beck and also Jimmy Page when I was there, and for a show. If we were going to play a show, they were considering a show at Rollout Hall. They were going to try to do something there. Cool. And so there's a lot of great plans that were kind of in place, and sadly, it just didn't work out, man. It just turned into some financial weirdness, And I'm not fully ready to talk about what happened just yet, but it's been a few years, and I'm going to divulge that at a different time. But it got weird. But I was bummed out that that I was let go from a situation that I started. But hey man, it's all good. I put out a record, and then now we made this other record. So it took a little bit of time, but I'm really, really super, super proud of the new album.
Yes. So let's talk about that. That's coming out in a couple of weeks, right? Brand new album.
Yeah, we got it's coming out next week.
Next week.
I think we're about 10 days out. I guess we're about 10 days away. Yeah, I'm super proud of it. Well, just started during COVID, and it was I moved to Nashville. After Supersonic Blues Machine, we put out Tell the Truth, and I was on the road nonstop touring behind that. Took a big long break here in Nashville, and then when we got ready to go back to work, COVID happened.
Yeah.
So I was like, damn, man, we just took this big extended break. Now we get ready to go back and freaking COVID. Right. And so And even right before COVID happened, I was getting ready to go back on the road and start playing shows again. And we said we need to make a new album. It's time to start working on a new album at least. And then boom, COVID. So we were already making. Joey Sykes reached out to me, and Joey had been a co-writer on a lot of the Supersonic Blues Machine stuff. He was a co-writer on the Tell the Truth record, and had written some songs, a few cuts on that record, and Supersonic Blues Machine. So I had been working with him indirectly through Fabrizio Grossi. And then once that relationship with Fabrizio Grossi kind of ran its course, Joey reached out and said, "Man, I want to work with you directly, and I want to make this record with you, and let's do this record." And we had already been working on songs from years before, even when Tell the Truth first came out. Like we had ideas, we were shooting back and forth. He was in LA, I was in Dallas, and we were shooting out some ideas back and forth. So we had songs we had been working on for years. So we had been talking, we've been trying to do this for a while. And so when COVID happened, that then pushed us into that whole home. It pushed me into that whole home recording situation. I knew I'd been needing to do it for years. I didn't have a setup. I was always on the road, or I was always doing something else, and not, or working on my gear and my guitars, and not focusing on a recording setup. And so that was the beautiful thing that COVID did for me, was that it allowed me to then, when we started to do that, was to set up a home recording system. And so Joey had ideas in LA. He would email them to me. I would put something on that, and then he'd send it back. And then he would have like the full on band track, whatever, sketch out an idea in LA. And we had all these great musicians show up. I mean, Joey, we would talk about it and go, "Man, who do we want to hear on this track? Who do you think would play that could really make this track work?" So we had, the great Brian Tichy out in L.A. from Dead Daisies, and Ozzy and Whitesnake played drums. Jurgen Carlson from Government Mule. Cool. We had Buck Johnson playing keyboards, who's in Aerosmith and the Hollywood Vampires. Cool. Peter Keys from Lynyrd Skynyrd played keys on it. Wow. We had Bobby Rondinelli from Rainbow and Black Sabbath playing drums. Danny Miranda from Blue Oyster Cult playing bass. I mean, just a whole slew of great musicians that were showing up. Greg Bissonette playing on the first single. Awesome. The top of the Ringo Starr right now. So, we had all these great musicians that showed up to play on the record, and we went, and we were doing that. And then once things started opening, we went to New York, and we tracked with like Bobby and Danny. We went up to New York and recorded with them. And then we did a lot of recording in a couple different studios here in Nashville. I was recording at home. Joey was recording in his studio in L.A. He went to various studios in L.A. We had the great Dan Rothschild worked on the record, who was Paul Rothschild's son, who produced Janis Joplin and the Doors. Cool. Justin Cordellieu, who's Bob Ezrin's right-hand man, mixed the record on a happenstance from a party. It's a great story because they had a party at Johnny Depp's house for Tommy Henriksen, who plays guitar for Alice Cooper, who had done a record with Mutt Lange, and they were having a listening party that was scheduled. And then Johnny had to do all the court stuff that was all on TV, And so he went, "No, guys, you still use my house and have the party." So Joey Sykes went to Johnny's house, and they're at the party, and the guy says, "I'm from Nashville. I'm working in Nashville." And Joey goes, "Oh, man, I'm working with my artists in Nashville." And then they meet, and they talk, and then Joey says, "I'm going there in 2 days." And Justin goes, "Well, I am too." So we ended up at a meeting back here in Nashville. And if Johnny had been in court and said, you guys can't have the party, I'm in court, that would have never happened. Wow. Like he allowed them to use his house and have that party, and Joey Sykes was able to meet Justin Cordellieu, and they were able to mix this record so phenomenally. I mean, sonically, it's probably the best album I've ever made.
Awesome. I know the fans are gonna love it. That's a lot of good artists. Which you're a great artist too. I mean, you've got all these guys working with it. That must mean that you must be doing something right yourself, right?
Right. Absolutely.
right? You've got
I
a
mean,
lot.
it's just getting up every day. It's just like, man, I just like now, like talking to you. I mean, we were in the studio in the middle of, we'd be like, oh, I got to call. I got to make a call because, we're down here. I got to call Gary because
Yeah.
we're in the studio. Yeah. It's like, I had to put the guitar down. We were we were here working so yeah, I mean that's what it's all about. Just getting up, trying to work every day, and be better than yesterday.
Well, when you've got the ability to do it, and you stand out, you got a lot of talent. Not too many people can say that they played with all these people and they're still playing after all these years and still making great albums. And I've been listening to it. It sounds great, man. You're a very talented guy. And I didn't mean to interrupt your day. Hey, and you can go back to recording, but maybe you could. Hey, maybe you could play me a song or something. What? I don't know.
Oh man, well, I got everything shut down
No,
now,
you're
but
good.
maybe next time, my man. But yeah,
No,
for
you're
sure.
good.
Well, Gary, thank you so much for having me,
Hey,
and
man.
thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for supporting Trouble is Good, and everybody can find me at lancelopez.net. Our tour dates are posted there. I'm also on Instagram at Lance Lopez Guitarist. I'm on Facebook at Lance Lopez Band, Lance Lopez TX. I'm not hard to find. So give us a follow, give us a listen, download the record, get you some orange vinyl. It's going to be pretty cool looking. So
Cool.
we hope everybody enjoys it.
All
Thank
right.
you so much for having us, Gary.
All right, man. Well, hopefully I'll see you out there somewhere one day. It can't be too
All
far
right.
away.
Take care. Well, hopefully we'll make it down to LA pretty soon. And I mean the other LA, Lower Alabama.
Amen. I'll be looking for you, man. Thanks a lot.
All right. We'll talk soon. Thanks, Gary.
All right, man.